Hey, welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics, or are your politics starting to shape your faith? In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our panelists for today. First, we have Ms. Carmela Monk Crawford, who's the editor of Message Magazine. We have Melissa Reed, who's the Director of Government Affairs for the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Ms. Bettina Krause, who's the editor of Liberty Magazine. And we have Jennifer Woods, who's the General Counsel and Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Lake Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Ladies, great to have you here with us again and looking forward to our conversation for today. You know, sometimes when we think about rules and regulations or even great days that are created in the United States, we think that they always go back to the Founding Fathers. But there's one day that's called National Freedom Day, and it occurs every year on the 1st of February. And thanks to President Harry S. Truman, that day became official on June the 3rd, 1948. National Freedom Day recognizes the end of slavery. It represents America as a symbol of liberty. And President Abraham Lincoln signing a joint House and Senate resolution, which eventually turned into the 13th Amendment. The interesting thing about this particular day is when we think about freedom, when we think about liberty, when we think about all these protections that we have under the First Amendment, the fact of the matter is so many things that actually come into play are based on the personal preferences of the leadership that's in charge. If Lincoln did not find himself in church on a regular basis, would he really have thought about religious freedom and creating a day of this nature? You know, Bettina, when I see some of these activities and we start to think about what our founding fathers believed and many of these quote unquote special days that get created and things that come into play, sometimes it's really about the fact that a politician felt a certain way because of a certain set of circumstances, and then we find ourselves almost creating these hallmark moments because of that, where we think that it has something to do with the Founding Fathers. And I think this falls into one of those categories. How do we try to juxtapose making sure that what we are celebrating, what we're doing in particular religious liberty areas actually has some foundation, or is it something that's just came on the whim of whoever was in charge?
You're absolutely right, Orlin. We all love history so long as it supports our agenda. And if it doesn't support our agenda, we'll change history. And, you know, Lincoln and the case that you cited, it's a perfect case study in how this comes about. Because President Lincoln, fantastic president, my favorite president, but he was a religious enigma. And he had this sort of habit of weaving religious thought and sentiment into his speeches. And he created some of the most soaring, inspirational presidential rhetoric in our history, in part because of these religious references. But when you look at his life, when you look at his biography, you understand that this was not a man of conventional religious beliefs or conventional religious habits. And yet the urge to sort of claim a towering figure from history, such as President Lincoln, for our agenda, and in this case for an overtly Christian agenda, an agenda to paint America perhaps more overtly as a Christian nation, it's a temptation that we have seen our leaders fall into over and over again.
You know, Orlin, I was reading about this holiday, National Freedom Day, and it was actually inspired or the project of an individual from Philadelphia who was born into slavery. And he very much had the desire to honor, and this as actually was the precursor to then Black History Month, of course, that being the month of February. And so I love how it was like a citizen action that brought it into fruition. Of course, then, you know, Congress passed it and Truman signed it. But going back to the conversation about faith and our political leaders, and, you know, we've talked before about there's no religious test for public office, and we're grateful for that. That said, I love when there's opportunities to see what does motivate individuals, particularly, as Bettina said, when it's things that we agree with or that are so critical to the humanity, to our, to the good of our community. And so I'm grateful. I'm not a Lincoln scholar. I don't know a lot about his faith. And I think actually that's a sign of a good leader if you don't know a lot about their faith, right? If they're protecting the rights of all individuals, not showing preference maybe to one tradition or another. So I don't know that he's my favorite. I don't know that I have a favorite, but he's definitely high up on the list.
Melissa, I think it's interesting because we were on a previous episode together. We were talking about Congress, right? And how many of them self-identified as Christian. And I think that in this day and age, there's almost an expectation that people claim a certain faith tradition and predominantly Christianity. And so it's so interesting that Lincoln did not need to take that approach to claim, yes, I'm a Christian, I believe in the Bible, all of these things. Now, based on some of the things that he did and some of the things that he said, it's clear that he at least was knowledgeable about Scripture. But I don't know how that would go in today's society, right? Someone being unwilling to unambiguously say, yes, I am a Christian and I believe in God. We're such a different climate today as far as what we expect from our political leaders, I think.
Carmela, what's really interesting is that you go from the 16th president, which is Abraham Lincoln, who, whether he was religious or not, used to always talk about freedom for religion. The next president is Andrew Johnson, who's the 17th president, who spent more of his time actually pardoning, some of the Confederate army leaders and completely wanted to do away with these concepts. So it's interesting not only that the whim of the president could probably lead to some of these things, but a quick change in who comes in next could totally undo the things. And that's why it seems like we have so many issues where every president wants to come in and start writing executive orders because you're trying to, quote unquote, undo what you think the last person did, which makes things even more confusing sometimes.
Yeah, you're testifying, Orlin. I agree with you. I think what we need to, I think the takeaway from this is just another realization of how fragile our agreements are, how negotiated they are. There may not be any deep, long-standing personal or moral convictions, but it's transactional. And that's a word that I hear batted around a lot today. And thus we, they change with the whims of the different people coming through. Abraham Lincoln, yes, for so many years, people called him the one who emancipated the slaves. But as we look at history, we realize that might not be true. It was a joint effort. Certainly African Americans who were enslaved at the time had played a big role. Frederick Douglass played a big role. It's a negotiated kind of thing. And it's, also a lesson to us that even under or with intractable slavery, even then, people were able to make headways with changing minds. That's where we need to be today, as intractable as some of our problems may be.
And it also shows, Bettina, why it's so important that we do go back to the First Amendment, that we do really find something that's rooted in a foundation. Because if we simply want to operate based off of what happens in an executive order or decide on what may happen based on some policy agenda that gets moved from, one agency to another or one state to another, the fact of the matter is that's like building religious freedom on sand as opposed to always going back to the rock of the First Amendment.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. You need that foundational principle to always go back to. And, as the other panelists have been saying, Christianity has been absolutely vital to the development of the American Republic, but its influence has not always been wholly good at all times. And I think that's a really nuanced and somewhat challenging idea for many people. I mean, consider slavery itself. It's true that the abolition movement, for instance, was very much fueled by Christian ideas. But then on the flip side, for centuries, slavery itself was justified by so-called good, upstanding Christians based ostensibly on Christian ideas. Mm-hmm. So if you want, this sort of drive that we're seeing these days to sort of claim America as this Christian nation and to sort of say that this is an unalloyed good, that this is something that is just should be embraced wholly. I think we need to step back a little bit from that. We need to be a bit more nuanced in our understanding of history. And most certainly we need to always hark back to the First Amendment to show us what religious freedom really means within the American Republic.
Jennifer, one thing I found interesting is many of the decisions that Lincoln made, in particular his view on religious freedom, was based on the fact that he thought that was a great thread to hold the country together. His idea is that the number one principle is make sure you save the union of all of these states staying together. And these are the different things we might be able to use. It isn't that different than what we may see even today, where there's some political leaders who look for certain agendas from a religious standpoint because it holds their own coalitions together. So it's so strange that what we think may have been something of the past, we actually see it repeating itself on a regular basis.
No, I think that is definitely correct. And when you frame it like that, it's almost as if religion can be used as a tool for political agenda, right? And I think that's why it's really important that we don't get caught up in labels, right? Like someone saying, well, I'm Christian, so therefore XYZ is correct. It's not so much important, as Melissa said. It doesn't matter what the political leader's religion is. It's do they uphold these foundational values that we have as a country and as a society. So I think that's something we need to be mindful of.
We're talking about the legacy of our nation and religious freedom. And I think we have to mention the separation of church and state and how that particular principle has really allowed religion to flourish here in the United States in a way that we don't see, and up until today, even, and we don't see that in other Western societies. I think recognizing the need for those separate spheres of God and government, right, is one reason why, and not in fact, elevating status or giving preference to one faith tradition. The fact that we're allowed as Americans to be able to honor our own conscience and our own belief system, I think is why we see religion flourishing in the way that we do in our nation.
And I think when you think about it even a little bit more, why is it so important for us to really look not to individuals, maybe not even to parties as it relates to this concept? And one of the things that was interesting is Lincoln was a person who quoted the Bible all the time, but when questioned about it, he said, I'm not sure that this is actually divine inspiration. But it seemed to sound good and be good and work for him. And that's why who can actually put a foundation of a country and principles based off of something like that? And Bettina, that's where I think we've got to be careful, even as we advise others in this area.
Absolutely. I mean, Lincoln famously said he wouldn't join a church, but he said, I will join a church if a church will put over its altar the words, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and thy neighbor as thyself. For him, religion was a very practical way of caring for your neighbor and for showing compassion for fellow human beings. He was not so much into theological discussions, but I think that is a really foundational idea to take away from this discussion.
And I think if we get to the point where we think about religious freedom and the concept of looking out for your neighbor and loving your neighbor as yourself, we'd probably find ourselves being in a great country and probably would see great policies that get created with that thought in mind. There's a case that's called Crosspoint versus Makin. And it is a foundational principle in civil rights law that the government may require compliance with anti-discrimination provisions in its distribution of public funds. So while a religious school may have sincerely held beliefs that motivates its discrimination, the state need not subsidize and support discriminatory conduct. Indeed, states have long used the power of the purse to protect the right of equal access to education, to employment, to housing, and public accommodations. Maine law provides that all students be afforded a free public education, But in districts where no public schools exist, Maine will pay the tuition for students to attend approved private schools. You know, when you look at a case like this, and you see that this is the foundation of what allows it to be in place, you can almost see that you will find yourself in court over the idea of what is an approved private school, who should be the individuals that should end up benefiting from this, and what happens when you start moving students from jurisdiction to jurisdiction to take advantage of it. And here we find ourselves in court. You know, Jennifer, when you take a look at a case like this, one of the things, I understand what Maine is trying to do, but how do you do it in a way where you don't end up running into the wall of religious liberty issues and the concept of when you're using public funds for religious activities?
Yeah, this is it's an interesting case because, of course, it has a history behind it, right? And we can go back to the Supreme Court case of Carson v. Makin, where this whole tuition program was questioned as far as whether religious schools could participate in this program, right? The Supreme Court said, you know, if it's going to be open to private schools, you can't say it's open to private schools except for religious private schools. Mm-hmm. But we all kind of saw that this was going to happen down the road, right? Maine made it clear that that even if the Supreme Court came out this way, that they had other ways of making sure that that schools kind of abided by their anti-discrimination laws. And so now here we have Crosspoint, who wants to participate in this tuition program, and they want to get the state funding, but they say, hey, we don't want to have everything applied to us. We want the funding, but we don't want to have the anti-discrimination laws applied to us because of our religious nature. And so we do have this tension here, right? Are religious schools entitled to receiving government funds without the strings that are often attached?
You know, and this goes to the point that government money is never free. It always eventually comes with strings attached. Let me put in a plug for Liberty Magazine here, because when Carson v. Makin, the decision came down in 2022, I wrote an editorial about this case, and I said the rest of the story, because eventually what's going to happen is that schools that want to participate in this are going to find themselves up against these regulations and conditions that go against their religious identity as a religious school. And they're going to have to make a choice. Do I participate, or do I hold out and just not take the money? Well, now they want their cake and they want to eat it too. And that's what this lawsuit is all about. You know, I'm just not convinced that it is a worthwhile project to try to force open the faucet of government money. It does not, in the long term, benefit religious institutions. Religious schools and institutions that become dependent on that funding. They become entangled with government regulation that they have to continually negotiate. And ultimately, history has shown us clearly, religious institutions start to, in many cases, lose their religious identity. And so, you know, Christians across the nation celebrated when Carson v. Makin, the decision came down in 2022. I don't think it was something to be celebrated. And I think this lawsuit is a good indication of why it's something that we should be looking at instead with caution.
You know, Orlin, I'm listening to my colleagues here, and I completely agree. And it's so interesting, again, how this is reflective of a change of perspective of people of faith, particularly those that run educational programs, parochial school system. Because for years and years and years, there was that recognition or that understanding of, I'm running a private Christian institution because my mission, or the mission of our faith, is so precious to us, that we want to have a place where our children can come and receive religious instruction. But also there was very much this fear of, if they engaged in taking funds from the government, that identity would be weakened. And so the decision was made not to participate. But now we see a perspective from some people of faith that, no, that's not the decision between whether or not our identity is cheapened or I don't take the money. Instead, it is, as Bettina very said appropriately, I want to have my cake and eat it too. It goes against sort of everything that I grew up learning about the need for the separation of church and state, why it's so integral for both the church and the state in order to function effectively and to maintain integrity, to stay in those separate spheres. I think it's a real change in perspective as far as what is appropriate, again, for people of faith.
You know, Carmela, they say in large part, this is a change of perspective. This isn't how it used to be. But one perspective that has not changed is the concept of no money, no mission. And the reality is many of these schools are believing, I can't get my mission out there unless I have the money. And if the money is going to come from this source in order to put my mission forward, then what's wrong with it? And I think the problem is when you are a religious institution, you have some discriminatory things that are built in to protect you. And so the idea of it doesn't seem like these two can peacefully coexist, but it seems as though the world and our society is saying, why not? I mean, do you see the problem here, or is this a tension maybe that we can figure out how to get smoothed out in some way?
I don't think we can figure out how to move it. I'm agreeing with what Melissa has said. This affects, and this goes back to our previous conversation on what do we base our beliefs that there's a separation of church and state. On the basic belief and tenet that I don't want to pay for as a taxpayer, I don't want to pay for your discrimination. I don't want to pay for your church program. I don't want to pay and subsidize what it is you're doing, right? And I think maybe I said that in not such a nice way or a Christian way, but I think the problem, that is the crux of the matter in a society that has people of all walks of faith and cultures and background. That was written into the Constitution to protect everybody's existence and try as best as we can to move in and around each other. So what we have done, early on, and I don't think this is new, but we have seen the devolution of the separation of church and state. So when they first started doing the emphasis on the faith-based organizations, they said, okay, let's keep you separate. Have a separate part of your entity. Now they don't require that. Make sure you don't proselytize. Oh, okay, maybe we'll allow a little bit of it. And so more and more and more, and the camel's foot is not in the door anymore. The whole camel is in here. And now we're all, as taxpayers, having to sort this out every time somebody wants cake, a daycare center, whatever. So yeah, it's a problem.
And I think it goes back to that, understanding the First Amendment, understanding the two clauses, right? Like there's the free exercise. We want religion to be able to function without government interference, but there's that other piece, the non-establishment, right? And it looks like here, we're kind of doing away with that. We want you to fund our school, but please stay out of what we teach and how we teach it and who we let in. So, it's a balance, and it doesn't seem like it's taking place here with what Crosspoint is asking for.
Here's some bad news for everyone on this panel. I mean, what we're saying, and I think we're all basically agreeing on a certain perspective, the Supreme Court does not agree with us. And it is on a trajectory. Its jurisprudence is heading down a path that eventually is going to mean that religious enterprises are funded more fully and with fewer restrictions. And I think this case, and I think many other cases, the St. Isidore case out in Oklahoma, these are all part of sort of a bigger picture across our nation of advocates and legal organizations that are working to force open government funding for religious institutions. And I think we should be thinking about it in terms of not if it happens, but when it happens. And I think we're going to be having conversations about the fallout for this trajectory for a long time.
So we feel very comfortable as far as where the Supreme Court is going. And as Carmela made the point, brick by brick, the wall of separation of church and state is eroding. And we don't see any sign of that changing. And so again, I go back to people of faith themselves. Just because something is legal doesn't mean it's appropriate, doesn't mean that you should do it, right? And so I would really appeal to people of faith, again, recognizing that this is not the role, this is not the realm of the spiritual, right? This is the realm of the public. And again, Jennifer pointed out there's those two clauses. There's the free exercise, but there's also the establishment. And we just have to look, so many examples of history of when we see the establishment of religion just detrimental to people of faith or just communities at large. That's certainly not history that we want to repeat here in the United States.
But Jennifer, one of the things it looks like is that religious organizations are putting up their own walls to separate what they may call the pulpit from our other institutions. So the idea that you may not see yourself taking money to build your church that somebody preaches in every week, but taking money to fund other aspects of what you may do from an organizational standpoint. I think if you were to talk about, will we allow the government to come into the pulpit? Absolutely not. But will we allow the government to come into our healthcare institutions, our academic institutions, our other institutions that do things from a community standpoint? It seems like the church, just from a, conceptual standpoint, wants to have its cake and eat it too.
No, I think you're right. And I think that what Bettina said, we need to think about again, and that is government funding is not free, right? It comes with strings attached, and we need to be very mindful of, as people of faith, what agreements we enter into, right, in the long term.
And we'll have to let that be the last word. But I think where we're going with all of this is understanding that if you do take the money, that you have no idea where you may end up when it's all said and done. Hey, Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
All right, Orlin, we talked about February 1st being National Freedom Day. Did you know it is also National CBD Day and also National Change Your Password Day?
I did not. Jennifer, tell me something I don't know.
Well, Melissa and I were on the same page on this one. So in addition to those other days that we celebrate on February 1st, it's also National Dark Chocolate Day. So make sure you have a piece of dark chocolate on that day. We
will make that happen. Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
So, Orlin, did you know that papal succession has always been really dramatic, and that in 897, Pope Stephen VI had his predecessor dug up and propped up on a throne and tried for perjury and illegal succession to the papacy?
No, I didn't know. Carmela, tell me something I don't know.
Did you know that we may celebrate Freedom Day or Juneteenth, but the 13th Amendment allows for people who are incarcerated to still offer unpaid service? And in the United States today, people are working for 32 cents an hour or no money an hour, and they are the ones that are propping up the prison system and mass incarceration.
Wow. Ladies, thank you for that information today. Great responses to our topics. And thanks again for you being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.